facing the students who come into these missions. And of course too, the notion of student in Venezuela, as it was and continues to be in Cuba, is the population, you know, because this is about young people, it's about adults, it's about everybody. Okay, what else? Oh yeah, also obviously the other thing to say is, yeah, Barrio Dentro, which is this nationwide health program. You know, this is no small thing too. You can't be educated and be an attentive, engaged student if you're sick. Mission Mercal, you know, some of the processes that are in place to provide subsidised food and actually make sure people are getting all the nutrition that they need, so on and so forth. So, you know, essentially the point to make is that we're, you know, rather than Gillard at this point in Australia will talk about social inclusion ultimately, and you know, there's a lot of emphasis on this notion of social capital, which requires another discussion in and of itself, but you know, that somehow everyone recognises that social capital is what fosters or gets in the road of educational, you know, access and successful outcomes. But under capitalism, that's left to you. I mean, you and your family, you have to just, you know, it's really ultimately up to individuals and their families to come up with that social capital. As I said, whatever that requires a discussion in and of itself. But in Venezuela, and certainly in revolutionary Cuba, you know, those social and economic material bases to enable full participation are in place. Just finally on this too, this point at the bottom is really, I guess, at the heart of what I'm trying to say as well today, and that is that education in Cuba is, and education in Venezuela is being constructed as a social good, and hence, you know, an end in and of itself rather than solely an instrumental tool for developing human capital. And in this sense, it's a distinct and important aspect of the ongoing revolutionary example of Cuba and now Venezuela. Just really quickly on this, because I'll probably run out of time, but it is interesting too when you're discussing 21st century socialism and particularly Venezuela and the model, the example that's providing today, is that this is different to previous socialist projects. Although, you know, there was a real diversity of experiences there too, and there's quite a lot more to say in detail, but essentially there are some points to make that draw out some of the main points I'm wanting to make. Obviously the expansion of public education has been a common feature, you know, across revolutions, whether it be the Soviet Union, the Chinese Revolution, others, aimed in the first instance at addressing, you know, the same thing, legacies of educational inequality and exclusion, and, you know, quite impressive results on that basis followed. However, in many cases, the primary role for education was eventually, and in some cases quite explicitly, reduced to the reproduction of an efficient labour force. You know, the emphasis became, and it's the same as schooling under capitalism, you know, ended up being on preparing good disciplined workers for the National Development Project. You know, very often, in some of those cases, it became, it resulted in meritocratic systems that are, you know, that are very similar to the aspirations of capitalist schools. So while the reproduction of labour was in context of massively reduced social and economic inequality, you know, so there were gains, and that has to be factored in. At the same time, the system still left unchallenged. Even though they were reduced, they were still real inequalities tied to educational credentials. You know, and then obviously you've also got the context of Stalinism, where education also took on and actually in some cases a very repressive political and ideological role. You know, and I mean, you've seen some of that imagery around, you know, the sort of formalistic, uncritical responses, you know, sort of whole rows and rows and rows of students just regurgitating back socialist slogans and that sort of stuff, and you know, which is just part of the degeneration of that project. So I think, you know, that's an interesting comparison in terms of the difference that I've seen anyway in Cuba and Venezuela. And there have been some really interesting discussions. Again, I'll just touch on it briefly and maybe it can come up in discussion, but there's been some very interesting discussions around that in Cuba. And I think one of the defining features of the Cuban Revolution has been its ability to really look critically at itself and certainly differentiate itself where necessary from other socialist projects and other directions that were taken. And certainly they were never, you know, ultimately, at the, you know, sometimes not quick enough and all the rest of it, and they'll be more critical of themselves than anyone else, I always say. But, you know, ultimately there's been a lot of discussion and debate about Cuban education over the time that's really looked at those examples and tried to avoid them. There's also the very strong influence of, even though people don't necessarily always know it, Che Guevara actually contributed quite a bit to the development of pedagogy and the idea of how education fitted into the Cuban Revolution, which was quite, you know, which very much challenge some of those aspects of a formalism and an uncritical and education policy, for example, in the degenerated Soviet Union. I suppose the point is revolutions don't come with a template, and I think, and actually, just really quickly, again, this might have to come up in discussion, but there's a very interesting debate going on in Cuba at the moment about this so-called generational divide. And you've got these new, young Cubans today who are extremely critical of a lot of aspects of the revolution and so on. In a way, I actually think that's part of what I'm talking about. Young Cubans are extraordinarily critical, conscious people, and they're because in many cases they're supportive of the revolution, but quite critical as well. And I think that's, I don't know, to me, it's another feature of the fact that they've gone through an education schooling process. Okay, I think I've got a tiny weeny bit more to say, and then I'll finish up. Okay, so this just really quickly, up on the screen, these are just two little snippets from the new National Bolivarian curriculum, which, as I said, was pretty much shelved temporarily because it was felt like it wasn't quite there yet. But it's currently being, there's a whole new round of discussion that's going on around it. But certainly the point to make about this, as I said earlier, is basically the shift of power essentially in Venezuela. The decision making around this is in the hands of, as I said, teachers and students and parents and so on. There's an interesting discussion about the influence of historic community and popular education movements in Latin America, right through and including, for example, some of the really interesting sort of radical education pedagogy, if you like, that's come out of some of the guerrilla armed struggle movements in Latin America's revolutionary history that's feeding into this current discussion in Venezuela, which is fascinating, and again, probably something I'll leave for discussion if we get a chance. But just to finish, so as I said before, Che Guevara sort of wrote quite a bit actually on this in Cuba, and he said in his famous text, Man and Socialism in Cuba, that education is a fundamental aspect of liberation. He said, as far as he was concerned, education in Cuba is considered as the arena in which the subject can become conscious of their abilities to influence society and history, both by advancing in technological know-how and inventiveness, and by developing their intellectual capacities as social interpreters and protagonists. He very much said that education was the key to unlocking all of our collective creative and human potential, and I think that, to me, sort of gets to the heart of, the ultimate, the critical connection between education and how it's perceived and how it's collectively developed in the context of a revolution. That's just, for me, such a central part of Cuba and what differentiates itself from other examples, and also what I think we're seeing in Venezuela. So it's a rejection of the uncritical sort of transmission of slogans and values, and instead it's a collective, rethink on where to now. It's debate, it's critical, it's participatory, it's developing and fostering individual consciousness of our abilities to be active social change agents, I suppose. I think I'll leave it there. Yeah, I'll stop and we can take up beyond that in discussion. Thanks.